After a promising first season, Happy Days was at a crossroads as Season 2 unfolded. One option was to stay the course, familiar, safe, and quietly losing momentum. The other was a gamble that would reshape the show entirely, with no guarantee it would work. Today, most people remember the leather jacket, the catchphrases, and Fonzie as the center of the show. What's often forgotten is just how uncertain Happy Days was before that version ever took hold. This isn't a season-by-season history. It's a look at the moment when Happy Days hadn't decided what it was going to be, because the version everyone remembers almost didn't happen. Happy Days didn't begin as a formal network decision or a bold programming strategy. It started as a casual conversation on a snowy winter day. In the early 1970s, ABC executives Tom Miller and Michael Eisner were stranded at a New Jersey airport, passing the time by talking about the kinds of shows the network no longer made. One thing that kept coming up was the old-fashioned family sitcom, simple, domestic, and rooted in everyday life. They took the loose idea to Gary Marshall, who was then producing his hit television series, The Odd Couple. Marshall had already tried something similar. In 1971, he filmed an unsold pilot set in the 1950s called New Family in Town. But Paramount declined to order it as a series, and the concept stalled. The material was later reworked and aired in 1972 as Love and the Happy Days, a segment on ABC's anthology series Love American Style. At the time, it felt like another idea headed quietly for the ABC vault. Then, the culture shifted. In 1973, American Graffiti became a surprise hit while Grease was drawing packed houses on Broadway. Suddenly, a romanticized version of the 1950s seemed possible. Happy Days was ABC's attempt to turn that nostalgia into a weekly series. When the show premiered in 1974, it was a single-camera sitcom, shot without a live studio audience. The tone was restrained, and the humor was small. The stories focused on Richie Cunningham, a cautious teenager navigating family life, school, and the mild anxieties of growing up in Milwaukee. Fonzie was there, but he wasn't a star. He barely spoke, and he was more of a presence than a character. There were no catchphrases, no spectacle, and no sense that the show was being built to last. The ratings were solid, and the costs were controllable, but nothing about Happy Days suggested it would become a cultural fixture. At this stage, it wasn't a sensation. It was simply a period sitcom, quietly existing with an uncertain future. A number 16 finish in Season 1 made Happy Days one of ABC's stronger performers at a time when the network was still struggling. CBS, meanwhile, dominated the ratings, with 9 shows in the top 10. Happy Days was one of the few shows keeping ABC competitive. But Season 2 told a different story. In the same time slot, CBS had Good Times, a breakout hit that was louder, sharper, and built for immediate audience reaction. Compared to that, Happy Days looked restrained and thoughtful, almost quiet. As the season wore on, the numbers reflected it. Happy Days slid sharply in the rankings, finishing Season 2 tied for 48th place. The show wasn't collapsing, but in a head-to-head fight, it was losing ground. Behind the scenes, Gary Marshall understood the problem. The show didn't need fixing, it needed energy. Meanwhile, a pattern was developing. Whenever Henry Winkler appeared as Arthur Fonzarelli, the room changed. In the early episodes, he was meant to represent the edges of the 1950s. Cool, slightly dangerous, but contained. The network was so cautious about that image that it dressed him in a windbreaker instead of a leather jacket to avoid looking like a hoodlum. Once the leather jacket was allowed, the reaction was completely different. Viewers leaned in, fan interest grew, and executives took notice. Inside the network, it became clear that something was happening, even if no one could quite explain it yet. As the ratings pressure increased, Marshall made a calculated gamble. Near the end of Season 2, the show experimented with filming an episode in front of a live studio audience. It was meant as a simple test to jumpstart the reaction, but the second the camera started rolling, they didn't just find a spark, they found a completely different show. That massive roar from the crowd created an immediate crisis for the writers. The show was built for Richie's quiet life, but the audience was only screaming for the guy in the leather jacket. But the Fonz didn't go to school or have a seat at the Cunningham dinner table. To keep Fonzie on screen, the writers moved him into an apartment above the Cunningham garage, becoming a regular presence in the household. A character designed as an outsider was folded into the family. That shift didn't happen by accident. ABC wanted more Fonzie, more visibility, more authority, more moments built to trigger audience response. At one point, executives even suggested renaming the series Fonzie's Happy Days. But when Ron Howard learned of the rebrand, he threatened to quit, and the idea was quickly dropped. Without ever being declared the lead, Fonzie suddenly became the center of the show. His presence resolved conflicts, and his approval carried weight. The show still claimed Richie Cunningham as its anchor, but everything now revolved around someone else. The shift was subtle at first, but it carried a cost. Happy Days was more popular than it had ever been, and it was clearly moving in a different direction. And it began to change around that new center. Once those reactions became part of every episode, the timing changed completely. Laughs weren't something you could plan on the page anymore. They were happening live in the room, and the actors had to follow them. Subtlety doesn't stand a chance against a live crowd, so characters like Potsy and Ralph stopped being grounded and slowly turned into reliable laugh machines. It wasn't about cutting corners, it was about playing to the room. If a joke landed, everything slowed down. If the applause kept going, the dialogue just stopped. Timing wasn't something you planned anymore, it was something you reacted to. Those reactions weren't built into the early scripts. They were discovered on the floor, then remembered, then designed in the future episodes. Writers began building scenes around that response. Entrances mattered more than exits, and moments were shaped less by plot than by how the audience would react, especially for Fonzie. The result was a faster, louder show. Quiet scenes faded away, emotional pauses shortened, and anything that didn't get an immediate response was pushed aside. By design, Happy Days became very good at giving audiences what they wanted. What it lost wasn't popularity, it was range. Once the show starts organizing itself around that instead of story, the change sticks. And Happy Days never went back. The moment Happy Days became a hit, it stopped operating like a normal television series and became a launchpad. Producers quickly realized the show could generate more than ratings, it could create other shows. Characters introduced into the Happy Days world weren't just supporting players, they were potential launches. The first proof came quickly. Vernon Shirley emerged directly from a Happy Days episode and became an instant hit. Mork and Mindy followed through an Even Stranger experiment, a one-off appearance built almost entirely around the belief that a performer could carry something new. From a business standpoint, this was a big deal. One series was now feeding an entire schedule, but growth came with its own set of problems. To keep the main show relevant, as everything around it kept growing, Happy Days had to stay flexible. Characters came and went, new faces were brought in, and supporting roles shifted based on what the rest of the schedule needed at the time. By the late 1970s, Happy Days wasn't just maintaining itself, it was holding everything else up. The phrase jumping the shark comes from an early Season 5 episode in which Fonzie literally jumps over a shark on water skis. It's become shorthand for the moment a show resorts to increasingly far-fetched ideas, often seen as a sign of creative decline. It's a term about perception, not performance. But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. By the time Fonzie put on the water skis, Happy Days had already changed what kind of show it was. The shift wasn't sudden, it had been building for seasons. Fonzie had been elevated from a cool outsider to something closer to a mythic figure. He no longer just bent the rules of the show's world, he operated above them. Entrances were built around him, and applause dictated pacing. Story logic adjusted to accommodate reaction. The shark jump didn't break the show's internal rules, it confirmed the new ones. In the early seasons, Fonzie existed at the edges. By the middle years, he could suspend reality entirely, and the audience accepted it. That's why the phrase stuck. Not because the show suddenly fell apart in one episode. Plenty of viewers felt it had already been sliding for a while, but because that moment made something unmistakable. It revealed that the original version of Happy Days was already gone. The shark jump didn't break the show, it just made it obvious. By the early 1980s, Happy Days had outlived almost every version of itself. The characters the show had originally been built around were no longer there, yet the series continued. When Richie and Ralph left the show, it leaned hard on Fonzie. He became the steady presence who could hold things together as new characters came and went. The settings were still recognizable, but they no longer functioned the same way. What once grounded the show now served a different purpose. Hairstyles got bigger, the pacing picked up, and the show moved with the times. The 1950s were still there, but mostly as window dressing. As the show wound down, the producers tried to bring things full circle. Richie came back for the finale, and the past was finally acknowledged. But the show was closing out a version of itself that no longer existed. The people at the center weren't the same ones we'd met back in 1974. In the moment, none of those changes felt like mistakes. They solved real problems, but the show slowly became something else. By the time the jukebox stopped playing, Happy Days had figured something out. The uncertain path of change turned out to be the only way it could survive.